Since 9/11, at least, who has removed more of your rights, more of your freedoms? Has it been the mullahs in Iran? Has it been Vladimir Putin in Russia? Has it been Kim Jong-un in North Korea? Have they removed any of your freedoms? Has Qasem Soleimani removed any of your freedoms? Or has it been your own government who has been responsible for removing your freedoms? Let's be very careful. Let's think critically about who is the greatest threat to our freedoms. What's being done through the media? A dialectic is being offered.
The sharing of biased and false
news has become all too common on social media.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think, and this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Extremely dangerous. Extremely dangerous. Extremely dangerous. Extremely dangerous. Extremely dangerous. This is extremely dangerous to our democracy. It's extremely dangerous. It's extremely dangerous. Extremely dangerous. Extremely dangerous. Extremely dangerous. Extremely dangerous.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Who should be responsible for protecting our freedoms? That job belongs to you. It's our job to do that. The government is good for a couple things: protecting our borders, protecting the nation from invasion, keeping the court systems fair and just. And that's about it. We don't need them for anything else. Who has removed more of your freedoms since 9/11? Let's look at a list of your freedoms which have not been protected. Number 1, the liberty to not be spied upon, which is essential to free society. At least that's what the founders believed. In the not too distant past, government agencies suspicious of citizens had to obtain warrants to investigate private citizens. They had to prove to a judge why they deserved to violate a person's sacrosanct privacy from the state. Multiple federal agencies, most notably the NSA, are unable to surveil citizens all the time. The government's paranoid desire for total surveillance has only grown since 9/11. The FBI, which built the NSA's foundation for dragnet spying, continuously throws temper tantrums over its inability to spy on encrypted communications. The Department of Justice argued recently that it should have access to all Americans' emails. Who's taking your freedoms from you? Number 2, the liberty to not be harassed by law enforcement. Police departments not only conduct their own invasive spying with secret technology provided by the federal government, where police officers were once trusted to protect life, not all, but in some cases, they now threaten it. Currently, the risk of being killed by a police officer inside your own country is anywhere from 8 to 55 times greater than being killed by a terrorist. That since 9/11, more Americans have been killed by the ones who are supposed to be protecting them than were killed by terrorists. Other violations by police, constitutionally speaking, include a basic protection against unwarranted searches and seizures. Now, we're not talking about police officers. We're talking about the system, the overall system. Something has changed in the overall system and the training. Unwarranted searches and seizures are common now. An egregious seizure of the freedoms Americans still drunkenly celebrate on national holidays. Number 3, the freedom of movement and travel without being treated like a criminal. It is surprising that the Transportation Security Administration, the TSA, formed after 9/11, is accepted as a vital element of modern society. Millions of Americans routinely huddle in cramped airport security lines, removing their shoes and flashing their private parts to security agents via x-ray machines so as to avoid more invasive gropings. Recently, 2 agents were caught tag teaming to grope attractive women. Who's protecting your freedoms? Unsurprisingly, these practices fail to find terrorists 95% of the time. They have a 5% success rate in locating terrorists. They have a 100% success rate in terrorizing U.S. citizens. Children in wheelchairs, the elderly, and otherwise innocent Americans are forced to endure what would amount to sexual harassment in any other environment. But remember, it's all for your safety and protection and convenience. Number 4, freedom of speech. The state has spent years incrementally criminalizing this fundamental right. What I'm doing right now, most likely very soon, this will not be allowed. And you know what's going to make that possible? Us falling into the pattern of saying things like, thank you for protecting our freedoms, when our freedoms are being plucked away one by one. The federal government has made a habit of punishing individuals who attempt to shed light on the government's crimes. During the years George Bush was in office, protesters were cordoned off into so-called free speech zones to air their grievances. Today, protests are heavily patrolled by police who do not shy away from pestering, if not abusing, people peacefully exercising their most essential constitutional right: freedom of speech. Red flag laws are designed to encroach even further on that First Amendment, that freedom that you and I are supposed to be protecting. Number 5, the liberty to simply know what the government does, also known as transparency. Today, we live in the age of national security. When might that be appropriate? When you're actually at war, you don't want information getting out. There is a war on for your mind and for your freedoms today. We're in a war, and that's why much of what's being done at the federal government level is veiled behind so-called national security.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions.
Lawmakers refuse to reveal details of foreign policy, surveillance, and more, citing national security as a blanket excuse.
The councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
Military-industrial complex.
This justification is how they perpetuated continued warrantless spying even after the Patriot Act expired. It is how they have instigated perpetual war with little explanation beyond quote-unquote grave threats. Whenever politicians feel threatened by real questions, they need only parrot the need for public safety and drum up memories of 9/11. Number 6, the liberty to not be harassed by the military in your own home. Following the protests in Ferguson against police brutality, the Pentagon's 1033 program has faced intense scrutiny for arming local police with high-powered military gear, from armored vehicles to battle regalia. This program has emboldened SWAT teams and other local police, paramilitary wings of law enforcement armed to the teeth. It has been normalized to see paramilitary on our streets. Who's protecting your freedoms? People will say, well, they're protecting us against criminals. Many times SWAT teams raid the wrong addresses. But even when they are in the right place, they inflict everything from beatings and murder on nonviolent, often innocent citizens, to shooting family pets. The 1033 program, intended to help fight the drug war, increased in power after 9/11, when its stated goal shifted toward preventing terrorism. Number 7, the right to a fair trial. One of the greatest revolutions of the Founding Fathers was ensuring fair trials to the accused. This banned cruel and unusual punishment while ensuring a speedy trial where the defendant was considered innocent until proven guilty, not the other way around. However, this right to a fair trial has been increasingly eroded by autocratic elements within the so-called justice system, especially since 9/11. And while we've been chanting mantras, thank you for protecting our freedoms, one by one, our freedoms and our rights are being plucked away right here in our own country, in our own backyard, right under our nose. Number 8, the liberty of owning your body. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of private property. You are your own private property. Free individuals may choose what they want to do with and put in their bodies. Though the drug war has been in full swing for decades, the events of 9/11 allowed the government to regulate people's body chemistry more heavily. We see many agendas at work today, passing laws that make it more difficult for people to opt out of certain inoculations or medical procedures. While the Patriot Act is widely associated with unwarranted surveillance, it was used overwhelmingly to prosecute nonviolent drug crimes and has helped to create the world's largest prison population. Is that freedom? Who's protecting your freedom? Number 9, economic liberty. While the state places many restrictions on economic freedom, it has done so for centuries through taxations, fees, fines, and regulations that favor corporations, increased piles of tax dollars to fund military adventures throughout the world. Though the military chronically eats up trillions of dollars every year, it demands more money, and nearly every year it gets it. Without the jarring images of 9/11 branded into Americans' brains, the military would have a much more difficult time securing funding. Those who disagree with such expenditures, whether out of fiscal responsibility or outrage at endless violence, must square off with the IRS, an entity more terrifying to most Americans than the government's more murderous agencies. While the events that transpired on 9/11 should never be forgotten and should be commemorated, the nationalistic grandstanding that comes along with mourning the dead removes any possibility to mourn the freedoms that we've lost. While the government is categorically to blame for these violations, it is an unfortunate fact that Americans are guilty of creating an environment where crimes against humanity go unchecked, and nearly every element of American life is regulated and surveilled. By allowing themselves to be manipulated by constant fear-mongering, Americans have allowed, if not applauded, and cheered for this confiscation of our own freedoms. So when it comes to protecting our freedoms, let's keep our eye on the ball. That's your job. That's my job. What is this movement that's taking shape? The movement essentially is communitarianism. What that means is the balancing of your individual rights with the rights of the community. Defined now as the global community, this is being pitched to you as the new enlightened form of political discourse. For everyone's security, for your health, to protect your children, to limit workplace violence, to stop bullying, to protect the rights of those in the future. All of these are laudable ideas, but somehow they always result in more restrictive laws that affect everyone. This is happening at the level of your local government, in your own backyard. So when it comes to protecting our freedoms, pay attention to your local government. Don't be so mesmerized by the media circus every day. Pay attention to what's going on in your own backyard. This plan is a whole life plan. It involves the educational system, the energy market, the transportation system, the governmental system, the healthcare system, food production, and more. It is a plan to inventory and control all of the natural resources, means of production, and human beings in the world. The plan is to restrict your choices, limit your funds, narrow your freedoms, and take away your voice, to manufacture consensus. And we see the mainstream media used constantly in this process of manufacturing consensus. Constant images of fear, fear-mongering, meant to push the masses into supporting whatever the government decides it wants to get involved with. Another is to infiltrate community groups, or at least start neighborhood associations with hand-picked leaders. Another is to groom and train future candidates for local offices. Another is to sponsor non-governmental groups that go into schools and train children. Another is to offer federal and private grants and funding for local programs that further the agenda. Another is to convert factories to other uses, introduce energy measures that penalize manufacturing, and set energy consumption goals to pre-1985 levels. Another is to allow unregulated immigration in order to lower standards of living and drain local resources. Everything that has happened was meant to happen by your government. Manufacturing consent. That's what we see today, right now, when we watch the news. And on social media, you can see that it's working. You see how easy it is to propagandize, to crystallize the public opinion into supporting nearly anything, even the removal of its own rights and freedoms. So when it comes to this idea of thank you for protecting our freedoms, don't forget, it's your job to protect your freedoms.